Hello, bio students. Topic for today is classification and taxonomy. Classification in terms of biology is referring to grouping together different living organisms into different categories, and taxonomy is simply the process of doing that. Probably this classification goes way, way back, thousands and possibly even tens of thousands of years, when it was probably quite as simple as there were things that were stuck in the ground and didn't move. They were stationary, and they probably had some sort of a name for what we call today the plants. And then there were these other things that did get up and run around, and you had to chase them. And they probably had some name for what we call today animals. And if you go back a couple of thousand years to the time of the ancient Greeks, these were probably even at that point the two classifications that they had of living organisms. Now, eventually, they probably realized that, well, not everything that was stuck in the ground and didn't move could actually capture energy from the sun, undergo what we call today the process of photosynthesis, was green in color. So there were some other things besides plants that were stuck in the ground. And today, these are the things that we refer to as the fungi, things like mushrooms. And then a few hundred years ago, with the discovery of the microscope, it opened up an entire new world to things that hadn't been seen before because they were simply too small. So these are the microorganisms, and that again necessitated some further categories in order to classify these. So if we take a look at this picture here, these three blobs that we see here are three different broad categories that we can place every single living organism on the planet into. And in fact, we can divide them into two groups. So the two groups would include this one here and this one here. So these two blobs at the bottom, we collectively refer to these as the prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are single-celled organisms. They're single-celled organisms that have a cell membrane around the outside, like all living organisms, but they don't have any internal organelles. So no um, chloroplast and no mitochondria, no nucleus, Golgi apparatus, and so on. So those are the single-celled enucleated organisms. The ones at the top here, we see here Eukarya, or sometimes referred to as the eukaryotes. And these eukaryotes, these are ones that can be made up of a single cell, but quite often they are what are referred to as multicellular organisms. And these are the ones that do have internal organelles, things such as the nucleus. So prokaryotes, eukaryotes, two very broad category-celled ones. The one at the top, ones that have a nucleus, multicellular ones. These three blobs are now what are referred to as the domains. And for the most part, we do consider the domains to be the three broadest of the categories that we place all living organisms into. So if we again start at the bottom, so these ones here, the bacteria, many, many different kinds of bacteria that we can find in extremely diverse habitats, all kinds of different ecological niches found on virtually, well, in fact, every habitat on the planet. From the top of mountains to glaciers, the polar ice caps, to the bottom of oceans, they can be found in all kinds of different environments. The one on the left-hand side, Archaea, are kind of similar in some respects. Underneath the microscope, they don't look much different than bacteria. They're very small. They appear on the surface to be very simple. But these ones here, in fact, they found them to be quite different than bacteria. And this is based on genetic information. So until fairly recently, like a couple of decades ago, these would have been clumped together and they would have simply been referred to as bacteria. But genetic information has now indicated that Archaea is different enough that it deserves a domain of its own. And these ones are often ones that are found in extremely hostile environments. And in fact, they're often referred to as extremophiles. So a couple of categories of them here. Thermophiles are ones that you would find in extremely hot environments. So things like the hydrothermal vents at the bottom of oceans or in hot springs. And halophiles you would find in extremely saline or salty conditions like the Dead Sea. If we do take a look back over at the bacterial side, you'll notice a couple of things that might look sort of unusual. In brackets, mitochondria. In brackets, plastids, including chloroplasts. So as you probably know, we do find mitochondria inside of both plant and animal cells. And we find chloroplasts inside of plant cells and inside of algae. So why do we have them under this domain bacteria? Well, the thinking is, and there's pretty strong evidence to support this, is that at one time, way back in time, and we're talking hundreds of millions or even billions of years ago, what are now inside of eukaryotic cells, mitochondria, and in plants, chloroplasts, were at one time single-celled organisms on their own. How did they end up inside of other cells? Well, they were engulfed by them, and the thinking is that they developed a symbiotic relationship, what is referred to as endosymbiosis, endo meaning on the inside, and symbiosis, they both benefit. So the mitochondria or the chloroplast now inside of a larger cell that engulfed it, they are provided with some protection. And those other cells are provided with a source of energy because both the chloroplasts and the mitochondria, they are energy conversion organelles. What they do is they make a lot of the universal energy source for cells, which is ATP. So those are two of the three domains. The other domain is, well, the eukarya. So eukarya is one of the sort of original ones that I had mentioned, the eukaryotes. Eukarya is all of the other living organisms. So in some cases, these are single cellular as well. So if we take a look at amoebas and euglena that are identified here, they are single-celled organisms, but they have internal organelles. And these ones are referred to as the protists. The protists. So paramecium, that would be another example of those ones. So they are microscopic. They're typically bigger than bacteria and archaea, but they are different in their appearance because they do have these internal organelles. So because of that, they are eukaryotes. There are some other ones that can sometimes exist on their own as single-celled organisms, and sometimes they form multicellular organisms. So one of those will be fungi. So fungi can exist in the form of things like mushrooms and truffles, which are multicellular, but they can also exist in single cellular form or filamentous form, things like yeast. The algae as well, they can form multicellular or at times single cellular organisms, and they sort of go along with the plant. So we throw in the algae, whether it's the green or the red algae, we throw it in along with the plants. And the final one that we see here are the animals. So if we take a look at a bunch of these, actually let me just erase a bunch of what I've scribbled on the screen to avoid all the mess. So if we take a look at this one here, the archaea, this one here, the bacteria, we know that they are domains, but they are also two of the six kingdoms. Six kingdoms that all living organisms can be divided into. And those six kingdoms are the archaea, the bacteria, fungi, animals, plants, including the algae, and the one that I did have written on the board, this one here, which are the protists. So those are our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kingdoms of living organisms that we fit into these three domains. What this also shows on this picture is a whole bunch of these branches. So what each one of these branches does show is a relationship, a connection, an evolutionary relationship, a common ancestor at some point in the past. And you may have noticed that right in the center here, they have a common ancestor of, yes, all life. So when was that? Well, somewhere around about, well, we'll say 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. So we are talking not just a little bit of time, we are talking long, long, long periods of time for all of this divergence to take place from a common ancestor. So Charles Darwin did say that this is exactly what he thought, that all life that exists today would originate or had originated from one primordial life form. And that is what we have identified here as the common ancestor. So kind of going back to the Archaea and bacteria, did mention that initially they thought that they were really kind of the same, that they were just different versions of bacteria. But genetic information indicates that, well, the first organisms on the planet, they were bacteria, but then we had this divergence later on. So in fact, even though Archaea may look a lot like bacteria, at least some genetic information indicates that in fact Archaea are more closely related on an evolutionary scale, more closely related in terms of certain components of their genetic information and proteins, more closely related to the Eukarya. This picture here is, well, I'm going to read it from the bottom up. So down at the bottom, what we do have is our three different domains. So again, we have the bacteria, we have the Eukarya, and we have the Archaea. Those are our three different domains. Every single living organism on the planet can be placed into these three domains. But then what we do is we refine it a little bit. So what we would say is that these three categories here, they are the broadest of the different categories in terms of classification, at least if we kind of ignore what I mentioned before, which was that the bacteria and the archaea, they are actually the prokaryotes, and the eukarya, the eukaryotes. At any rate, what they're showing here as we go up is that we're going from these very broad categories to the narrowest. So narrowest kind of meaning that it is very, very specific in terms of the individual, well, species that we are identifying. So starting from the bottom, from the domains, what they're doing is they're zooming in on one of the four. Remember that in Eukarya, there are four different kingdoms. So this one right here might be the fungi, and this one right here might be the plants, and this one might be the protists, but they're taking a look at the animalia. So now they're saying out of all of those living organisms that have cells that contain internal organelles, let's take a look at the ones that are the animal cells. So that is the kingdom Animalia. And then they're refining it a little bit more, and they're saying, okay, out of all these ones that are in the animal kingdom, let's take a look at the ones that have a backbone. So there are a whole bunch of animals that don't have backbones. So think about things like worms and think about insects. Those are animals, but they don't have a backbone. But here they're saying, let's look at the ones that only have backbones. That's these ones here, and they are called chordata. They are in the phylum Chordata. So kingdom is more specific than domain. Phylum is more specific than kingdom. So now within the animals that have a backbone, now they're saying, let's take a look at the ones that have characteristics like they have hair at some point in their life, and the females produce milk. They have mammary glands in order to feed the babies. They are warm-blooded, and all of those ones we're going to clump together, and well, we call them the mammals. So they are in the class mammal, and that is more specific than phylum. Now, out of all the mammals, this picture is saying, let's take a look at the ones that eat meat. Those are the carnivores. Let's take a look at the ones that eat meat and the ones that are cats. Those are the felines. And we just get more and more and more specific. So when we get to the top here, the most specific is going to be the species name. And the species name actually has two parts. The first part, in fact, is the genus name. And the second part is the more refined species name. So this is as specific for the most part as we can get, although sometimes they kind of throw in some subcategories as well. So they might talk about subspecies. But this one here, because there are two names, it is called binomial, and it's referred to as binomial nomenclature, the format that we use in order to give the specific name for a living organism. So in the case of us, we are Homo sapiens. I mentioned subcategories. It's becoming more common now, and evidence is supporting the fact that we may not be the only species. Well, we are now, but at some point we may not have been the only species of Homo sapiens on the planet. So some people are now referring to us as Homo sapiens sapiens. That would be the subspecies name. And they think that Neanderthals were members of the same species. So they would be Homo sapien Neanderthals. And there's another group called the Denisovans. They would be referred to as the Homo sapien Denisovans. This picture, very, very similar, so I'll just use it to kind of talk about the same thing and just reinforce what we saw on the previous slide. Again, at the bottom, what we have is the broadest of the categories, three of them, the three different domains, and this arrow here, again, that says as we're going from the bottom to the top, we're getting more and more specific. So if you say that you have an organism that you found and it's eukaryotic, that could include millions and maybe even tens of millions of different possibilities. So we need to narrow it down a little bit more. So out of the Eukarya domain, maybe we just want to take a look at the animals. Well, so if we take a look at the ones that we have at the bottom, this one's a protist, so we're not going to count this one. This one looks like a fungi. We're not going to count that one. This is an animal, looks like a worm. This is an animal, looks like an orca. This one here looks like probably an algae, so we're not going to include that. This one is a snail. That's an animal. This one is a plant. We don't include that one. And this one is a bird, so we would include that one. So all of those that I've checked off here, we could throw into the kingdom Animalia. So the next box that they have going up from the bottom, it includes a whole bunch of them, not necessarily the ones at the bottom, but we do notice have this bird in both one of those, and that's the one that they're kind of focusing on with this picture here. Then again, we make it a little bit more specific. We're taking a look once again, as with the previous slide, as those that have the backbone. So all of these ones identified here have a backbone. Now for the next one, the class that we have is aves. So these are the birds. So remember, they're all eukaryotes, they're all animals, they all have a backbone. Now these are the ones that are specifically the birds. And then we just refine it more with the order, the family, the genus, and finally we end up with the binomial name. And in this case, kind of unusual, but the species name is the same as the genus name. So it is Cardinellus cardinellus, the name that we would use for this one in terms of the binomial nomenclature. So how do they determine this classification? In terms of formalized scientific classification of biological organisms, it kind of goes back to the time of Carl Linnaeus a few hundred years ago. Now, Linnaeus was not an evolutionary biologist. People didn't really talk about evolution at the time of Carl Linnaeus, and this is not based upon evolutionary relationships that he would have classified living organisms. It would have been based upon their physical structure or morphological traits. So in this picture here on the left-hand side, what we're taking a look at is we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different animals. So all of these are in the same kingdom, which is the animal kingdom. And what we're taking a look at things that you can visibly see. So what are these things that we can take a look at? Do they have a backbone? Do they have hinged jaws? Do they have 4 walking legs? Do they have an amniotic shell? And do they have hair? So if we take a look at the first row, we can see that 5 out of the 6 they do have a backbone. One of them doesn't. So the picture at the right-hand side, what it identifies the lanceolate as an outgroup. So it is different. There's something different about it compared to all of the others. So what that tells us in terms of an evolutionary plan and in terms of evolution and how these different species did arise is that there is a closer common ancestor between the other five. And that allows us to develop what is referred to as a phylogenetic tree, which is based upon evolutionary relationships. So the way to read this, we don't know what the time is, but what we know is that the further you go back in this direction here to the left, that is back in time. And remember that for evolution, we're talking about long periods of time. And in this case, we're talking about hundreds of millions of years back in time that there may have been a common ancestor between the lanceolate and all of these other five that we have here. So what has happened since then, since this outgroup has sort of been separated from the other five? Well, evolution has taken place and there's divergence. So if we take a look at the next trait here, hinged jaws, we can see that out of the remaining five, four of them have the hinged jaws. So now the lamprey would be the outgroup, and the other are more closely related to each other. So whenever we see one of these branch points here, that's where we have this divergence. And that's going back in time, and that's showing that there was a common ancestor. So at this point here, there would have been a common ancestor between salamanders and between the turtle and the leopard. Because the turtle and the leopard have a branching point further to the right, what that shows is that they are most closely related on the evolutionary tree. Their genetic information would be more closely related as well. So the final picture that I have to show you here was from Scientific American a few years ago, and a really small picture here, but it does show the two kind of co-discoverers of evolution by means of natural selection, and that is Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. So it's kind of a small picture, but let me just point out a couple of things. This is millions of years at the bottom here. This says when the Earth was formed, and that is about 4.6. I'm just going to put BYO for billion, or BYA for billion years ago. 4.6 billion years ago when the Earth was formed. Now, it took a long time before there was any life on the planet. So how long did that take? Well, almost a billion years. So at this point right here, this would be the common ancestor of all living life forms that exist on the planet today. So when was that? Well, again, we said that it was somewhere around 3.5 billion years ago. So that's a billion years to go from the Earth forming to having the first living organisms on the planet. So if we take a look at the bacteria, what you should notice is that that's all there was for an immense period of time, like about a billion and a half years. That's all there was were bacteria. There was nothing more complex, although there was probably some progression as well, probably some increase in complexity. The bacteria that we would find at this point here were probably much, much more complex than the bacteria that were initially formed. So then about, well, 2 billion years ago, we do have some of the other kingdoms and domains that arise. So the next one would be Archaea. And that's about the same time as the plants as well when they did arise. And these would again be very, very simple plants when they did first arise. So if we take a look at what the first living organisms were and what we have today, well, notice that bacteria, of course, are still around. So if we talk about any successful organisms on the planet, it is the bacteria. They were the first, and there are still many, many of them today. And like I mentioned, occupying all kinds of different habitats and providing all sorts of different roles within those habitats. So as we kind of go through the years, bringing us up to today, so now we have bacteria, we have archaea, first eukaryotic organisms, we have plants, so those other eukaryotes would include protists as well. Here we see the evolution of fungi as they arise. We see some animals, simple animals like echinoderms and sponges. We see some fish here, the age of fishes kind of going back about 300 or 400 million years ago. Amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals eventually. And what about us? Well, we're right about here. So we have been on the planet in terms of our species, Homo sapiens, we think somewhere around 200,000 years. 200,000 years.